All right. It is the week of January 25th, 2024, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we've got a lot of ground to cover, mostly TKO news. But before we get to that, we are going to talk about the UFC Antitrust lawsuit updates. Judge Boulware did make a couple of key rulings and decisions we need to discuss, as well as push back the trial date, still in April, but push back nonetheless. And we need to talk about the expectations that we can have for the outcomes of this trial, as well as what not to expect and everything in between. Because unless there's a settlement in the 11th hour here, we are going to court, and it's going to be a very interesting month of April and May for us MMA business nerds. Then we're going to move on to TKO stock news. Lots has been going on in terms of TKO, specifically over in the WWE side of the house. Massive media rights deal. A couple investment analysts have downgraded the stock from buy to hold for the first time since the stock went public. We're going to talk about why they did that and evaluate whether their analysis is pretty sound or not sound. And then obviously new allegations coming out about executive chairman of the board TKO, Vincent McMahon, that are pretty horrific and could obviously affect TKO stock depending on how big the scandal is. So we're going to break all of that down. Then we're going to do a deeper dive into TKO's brand image. So along the same lines of the Vincent McMahon issues, we obviously had Sean Strickland cause a bit of a stir amongst both the MMA community, but the wider media community as a whole. And we need to talk about what type of branding TKO is selling here with both of their companies, and if it could end up hurting or even helping their stock price and target consumer acquisition. So I will break all of that down based on the trends I'm seeing, but it's pretty amazing and a shift from where both companies were even just 10 years ago. Then we're going to talk about Kayla Harrison signing with the UFC. Is there actual star power being brought over? I've seen a lot of people in the MMA space, say that Harrison is a massive signing. It's going to be a really big deal. But we're going to take a look at Harrison's time in PFL, how much she moved the needle based on metrics we can track, and whether or not we can expect her to kind of rise to stardom in the UFC space where it's a little bit more crowded than, say, PFL was when she was starting out there. And last but not least, we are going to get to some PFL Bellator updates based on their press conference. They just had the Champs versus Champs conference. A couple of business notes with PFL CEO Peter Murray coming out and stating a lot of plans for 2024 and the future that we need to address. So with that in mind, timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, so first thing I want to talk about today is some updates in the UFC antitrust lawsuit case. Still plan on getting to the documents that have been released. It's been kind of a slog of it. I haven't had the time with other obligations, but my hope is to get to them towards the end of this month and into early February for some episodes going into February as this trial gets closer and closer. With that in mind, a couple of key updates here. Judge Boulware did deny the UFC's motion for summary judgment on the case, which was their last long shot hope, honestly, of avoiding a trial. UFC essentially asked the court to rule the trial as unnecessary, as no reasonable juror would ever side with the plaintiff's claim. Judge Boulware shot that down. As Paul Gift points out, by the way, Paul Gift and Jason Cruz both did great breakdowns of this stuff, so check out their work. But in a Forbes article here that Paul had put up, he did point out that the reasoning behind this was a little bit puzzling in terms of basically Judge Boulware said this was a duplicative process and that the standard for class certification was stronger than just, this particular motion. So there was no reason to look at it again. And he calls it lazy. I'd have to agree, in this particular regard. But either way, that motion has been denied. A trial date has been set. It was originally supposed to be for, I think, April 8th. It's now been pushed back to April 15th. So just a couple days after UFC 300. As I mentioned on last week's podcast, WrestleMania and UFC 300 going on either side of the trial date, I think was kind of a little bit purposeful in terms of building those events up so big just to kind of distract from media attention. Now, unfortunately for the UFC and WWE, that will not be as much of a distraction. We'll see how UFC 300 goes, but still, there'll be a couple days removed from that event, so media can kind of shift to the trial a little bit more. And it's expected to be a 4-week trial. There have been a couple other decisions regarding, basically, some housekeeping type stuff, as Gift mentions in the article here. Terms of procedural stuff, nothing that's nothing of note here, right? Like, I mean, they're going to select jurors ahead of the April 15th date. It's going to be a jury trial, so that's for one. And for people thinking it's just going to be Judge Boulware deciding, it's not. It will be a jury trial. And keep in mind, in these cases, it's not like a criminal trial, right? Where it's, if one juror holds out, that's it. It's much more of a majority type status in this scenario. So, you don't need to convince every single juror that they're guilty. You just need to convince a little bit more than half the pool in order to win. And another thing to keep in mind here is that while we will get some more documents and depositions, we'll probably get some people called as witnesses, right? I would expect that Dana White will be called as a witness, but they're mostly going to focus, or at least his deposition will be entered in, but they're mostly going to focus on, sort of these models, right? The Topple and Zimambulist models and Singer, in terms of what counts and what is believed to be this monopoly power through these economic models. I am not the best source on that. I've done my research on it for sure during classification, but again, Nash, Gift, and Cruz are all over that sense of things. Do have an article that I wrote regarding fighter MRP, which can come to account here, where in terms of fighters actually making money that they generate, tends to be that the top fighters are the ones that are underpaid, not, somebody you're seeing on the prelims or early prelims. They generally take away from the actual cost. It's mostly at the top that's drawing these cards, right? Which, I mean, if you see people complain all the time, like, how are people not going in to see the early prelims and paying like $300 or $400 for those, seats? I mean, nowadays it's like $1,000, $2,000 for some of the lower bowl seats, and they're not showing up for the prelims and they're barely making it to the main card. Well, they really only care about the main card, right? Casual fans, that's just how it is. So when you're looking at this, again, the economics and the math behind it is definitely a little wonky, and it will be interesting to see how a jury reacts to it. As we talked about long ago during class certification, and this is ages and ages ago, but just to remind everyone, some of the modeling here from the plaintiffs, from the UFC side, was experimental, or had some holes in it that UFC kind of poked through and made economics people be like, oh, that's a good point in terms of this might not work. Obviously, Judge Boulware saw enough to believe it did, but it's going to be interesting to see what a jury does, right? How they weed out members of the jury will be interesting too. It's if a jury doesn't have a particular economic background, right? Like economics background, are they going to understand all of the math being presented from these expert witnesses, right? Like some of this math and these models are a little bit more advanced. So, how will that be presented by either side? It's going to be very interesting. Very interesting, I feel like, in terms of seeing which side is able to get the upper hand through convincing, 12 ordinary people, hey, this is monopoly power, or this isn't monopoly power, etc. But I don't think there's going to be a settlement reached prior to going to trial. Now, while trial is occurring, I feel like people forget that this can happen. While you're in the middle of trial, if the UFC feels like it's really not going their way or vice versa, you can still make an offer, right? To try and settle part of it, to end the case, to kind of, get it over and done with, hedge your bets, because you never know how 12 random people are going to vote at the end of this. But I don't foresee it happening before the trial. And it'll greatly depend on how the first week goes. If you look at maybe one side is reaching out for a potential deal, depending on, again, how things shake out, what jurors might believe. I think one thing that people need to expect, though, is that there is no injunctive relief here, right? Plaintiffs have given up on that. So that's big. There will not be the, hey, you're out of your contracts for the fighters moving forward. This only affects everybody up until 2017. The Cage and Johnson suit that is separate from this and has been kind of, separated from this particular suit, that could affect current fighters, but that's not anywhere near, complete and done, right? This is going to happen first for sure. So that's waiting in the wings, but it's still way out there, and no injunctive relief is going to happen. So you're not going to see John Jones suddenly be a free agent, or Adesanya, or people that could draw quite a bit just be able to leave the promotion and go to other promotions, like we talked about as a possible option, or limits on length of contract or anything of that nature. That's not going to happen in this case. They've basically given that up, said, nope, we're dropping that. We just want to go after damages, because Boulware made them decide, like, do you want injunctive relief or do you want damages? And plaintiffs, representing most fighters that are now either retired or towards the tail end of their career, are going to opt for damages, right? So you're just looking at a monetary blow here, and possibly setting up the Cage and Johnson suit, but that's kind of a different beast, especially with some of the changes the UFC made in response to this initial suit, right? And Endeavor taking over the UFC with sunset clauses, far more free agency, things of that nature. That's a harder uphill battle, but this is still big. The fact it got this far is very big, and it could still be a significant amount of money that TKO has to pay. I mean, I believe the number that's thrown out there is 1.6 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, this company is making about $1 billion, in revenue, 700 million in EBITDA profit. So, it's not like end of the world, but it could definitely hurt them quite a bit, and it could affect, the stock value quite a bit, which we'll get to when we talk a little bit more about some of the investment analysts downgrading from buy to hold. But with that in mind, you're still looking at a pretty big deal, eyes on the UFC in a certainly negative light, depending on how this case is ruled, and more information coming out about fighter contracts, the way things are done, strategy that the UFC implemented. But you can't expect the business model to change. There's nothing, and even, UFC's lawyers have stated this. The business model is intact, no matter how this goes. Could be $1.6 billion, could be several hundred million, could be nothing. The business model is going to remain intact. Nothing is threatening the current model that they have. And moving forward, nothing is going to threaten it from this particular lawsuit. So that expectation needs to be set. If the plaintiffs win, get up $1.6 billion, there's going to be a bunch of people going, oh my gosh, like, this could be it. Like, this is the downfall of the UFC. Everything's changed, blah, blah, blah. No, it'll be a big blow to TKO. I'm sure they will have to do some restructuring. I'm sure some people will get laid off. I'm sure fighters will be cut, especially those that aren't drawing as much. But it's not a crazy game changer that we talked about being a possibility originally when class certification started. That's been abandoned. Injunctive relief could have changed the entire game. This will just hurt the UFC in its pocketbooks, which is still big, but it's the equivalent of some of the fines you've seen big banks eat all the time, right? Wells Fargo has, I don't know how many fines, massive fines they've eaten in the past several years. a little bit before the pandemic and definitely during the pandemic, they've eaten just so much from doing some pretty shady things. It's just money. Their business model still remains intact. They haven't had to break anything up. They haven't been, close to bankruptcy, anything like that. For them, it's a huge fine for how they got to where they are now. So that's kind of what you're expecting here with TKO. That expectation needs to be set. And yes, there will be more mainstream media attention on it, I believe. Had a couple of things. A Hollywood Reporter put out an article. I would imagine as this ramps up, New York Times might get back into it, or Rolling Stone, or some more mainstream outlets covering it. But it's not going to be this like earth shattering holy crap. Now the stock might react that way because that's what investors do, but it's not going to change their strategic advantages. It's not going to change their position in the market or erode their market power and position. Only thing it's going to do is erode their coffers, right? Like, and make it harder for them to do, stock buybacks or dividends and things of that nature. But it's not going to hurt them in this crazy way. So that expectation needs to be set. Um, it will be a good look, right, at everything that's happened, from 2010 to 2017. And again, some of the tactics that were used under both the Endeavor umbrella and the old Zuffa era. But it's going to be a very interesting time. I will not be there the first week. I may be able to get there starting the second week of the trial, but that's still kind of a long shot right now. I have some family obligations I have to do the first week, but we'll see about the second week. But either way, I will be glued to it, and I'll keep you updated with any other major updates. Set those expectations, though. You're going to see some over exaggerations from everybody, and you've got to be careful about what you read out there, because this is big and it could hurt TKO, but it's not going to kill him at all. So let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know if you think plaintiffs have a chance of winning or not. I would love to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think, UFC is going to have to pay here. If you were a juror, right, would you vote for or against the UFC based on what you know? If you've been following this, let me know, because I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on all of this stuff. All right. Next thing we are going to discuss is some TKO stock news. Lots of things happening in the TKO world. If you didn't hear the news already, although my guess is you did because it was all over the place, WWE has found a new home for their Raw brand. They had previously found media rights for SmackDown to USA, NXT to CW, and now Raw, Monday Night Raw, is going to Netflix for $5 billion over 10 years. This particular deal does have the option to terminate early. So within 5 years, Netflix could terminate it, or they could extend it hypothetically an extra 10 years, it sounds like, for 20 years, which is wild to talk about. Along with this, you had Dwayne Johnson, The Rock, join TKO as a board member, getting a huge, I believe, stock payout of $30 million or so, and the ownership to the name The Rock, which will obviously yield a ton of money for him in terms of branding, things of that nature. And he rung the opening bell at Wall Street, and it's a pretty big deal, and will radically shift WWE's business model because they're consolidating most. We don't know about all, but most of their international rights into this Netflix deal, and it's all going to be on Netflix instead of having, a UK deal, a deal in, France or wherever. It's all, the WWE network is going away. It's instead going to all be on Netflix internationally. Here in the US, there's still a Peacock deal that runs through March of 2026, so they'll still have some events in the library. But starting in 2025, Raw will be on Netflix, which is a big step too on the Netflix side, because that's going to be really their first foray into live programming, right? They're going to have a live weekly show. They've had a couple of live things, a couple of comedy specials, I think a couple of like game show reunion things and a couple things here or there. I think they maybe did a NASCAR race at one point, but it's really a big step for them into the live space instead of the classic. Here's a 10 episode series and or a documentary or a movie, and you can either binge it all or we'll add an episode per week type thing. Instead, it's nope, it's live TV, and they're gearing that up to compete with other streaming services like Peacock, Apple, as things get more intense. Amazon, right? Who's got NFL, so big change there for Netflix. Huge deal on the WWE side. Brandon Thurston over at WrestleNomics has done a lot of great reporting on this. If you're looking at the business side of WWE, he and John Pollock are the authorities, I'd say, in regards to that. So check them out. But it is a 1.3 media rights increase, 1.3 times media rights increase at best, 1.2 to 1.3. A couple of different analysts, Thurston, I forget the name of the guy over at Lightshed. He got the same numbers. I did a very brief overview of that, of looking at the numbers and checking that out. And, Brandon's math all made sense to me. Based on what I was seeing, I would agree that that's probably correct, that it's a 1.2 to 1.3 times increase, which is lower than the 1.4 they were aiming for. But I think the Netflix brand carries a lot of it. And, Ari Emanuel on an interview with CNBC basically dodged a question and danced around it a little bit in terms of when asked, what is the multiple compared to your previous Raw rights deal? He said, it's in line with expectations. They're going from 265 to 500 million, but a couple of, variables there that check out Brandon's analysis on it if you want really good in-depth dive to that, because he already did. But with that in mind, that's still huge news for the TKO brand. And in terms of how it affects the UFC, well, that's one of my predictions already for the new year that I'm going to have to revise a little bit in terms of, I originally stated I thought that UFC and Raw were going to be on the same service, right? I thought that made the most sense, that, they had until basically the end of the year to get a deal done, like around October. The fact it's coming out now is pretty huge, and nobody saw this coming. Amazon was looked at as an option, according to John Orend, as we talked about last week. But, nobody really expected Netflix to be the chosen service, especially this early in the game, right? The current media rights still go for the rest of the year, so that'll be interesting from a partnership standpoint. How WWE and USA Network will react to that, and how Peacock will react to that, because obviously Peacock is, definitely under threat of losing their deal that comes up in 2026. And they might be okay with that, but writing's kind of on the wall, you would assume, if you're Peacock. So that's a big move because they paid $5 billion, which is $500 million a year. And again, it's not like they get $500 million a year in every check. The deals are structured in a way that a lot of the money comes on the back end for media rights deals. I would expect that's the case here. But in terms of just the deal itself and the length, it points to a couple of things. One, I've talked about before how the media rights market has been, getting worse, right? It's not a complete meltdown, like we're not buying new shows. It's a huge issue, or we're paying basically what we're paying now, or we're not buying it. So it's not that bad, but it's definitely lost its appetite compared to, the heyday of the 2010s, where it seemed like if you had, as streaming became more and more prominent, companies and shareholders were okay with losing plenty of money to acquire new subscribers, so long as, they had and were getting big rights deals. That was DAZN's whole plan to move into the US. It obviously didn't go the way they wanted, but they backed off. But ESPN Plus was not making a ton of money as a streaming service, still isn't. ESPN's doing fine, but ESPN Plus is not, as far as I know, not turned the corner in terms of that profitability. You have, basically almost every streaming service out there not making money. Netflix, I think, is the lone exception, where they've basically reached that pinnacle of like, okay, we're, as more and more people cut cable, Netflix should soon, they're going to be the first to eclipse um, cable in terms of like subscribers. I think that's pretty clear. But they're the leader, and they're definitely um, doing a lot better than most in terms of profitability with some of these streaming services. All these places are trying to make streaming profitable, but it's tough. And even Netflix had to, bring in ads. They said they would never do ads, and you could always share passwords. That was a huge thing they promised for a long time, and that has obviously gone the way of the dodo for them. And they're talking about basically getting rid of, or they already have gotten rid of, their lowest ad-free tier, because they want more people to watch ads because they want the ad revenue. And they said in their earnings call, which happened this week, actually the same day that TKO announced The Rock coming on board, as well as the Raw deal. Netflix had their earnings call and released their earnings at the end of the day, and they did extremely well. But Netflix talked about, like, we're not necessarily getting to the live sports space, which is I don't know about that. And then this is a place we can see a lot of growth is ad revenue, and that it's not going to be immediate, but there's a huge amount of growth here. We will get the sponsors, we'll get these things going, etc. That's a massive deal, and that's obviously been reflected. But paying $5 billion over 10 years, I doubt they're going to have the appetite to pay the UFC what it's asking, and I doubt the UFC is going to settle for um, anything less than what Raw is getting, right? I mean, if you look at the average, the AAV of the UFC deal, it's about, like, I think 300 million ish, and they've been trying to target, and it's just US rights, right? Not international. They've been trying to target at least double that. And so when you're taking a look at Netflix as a suitor, right? Netflix got everything for WWE. The international deals is pretty big. It's not the same way where the UFC international rights deals are doubling and are a huge key piece in terms of their growth, where UFC is not going to want to give all of that up unless it's a really sweet deal. It's, and domestic is still king, don't get me wrong, but UFC has been consistently going into markets and doubling their rights fees this past year, and they're not going to want to give that up and take losses, especially when they think they can double their rights fees domestically. And I think it's going to be extremely hard for them to double their rights fees domestically. Don't get me wrong. I don't think they're going to actually pull off a 2x increase. I just don't see it given the market. I think WWE is kind of a sign of things to come with some of this stuff. NASCAR obviously got a sweet deal, and so it's possible, but I think the appetite for it is going to be tough, especially with the NBA rights still out there, which is, a far more valuable piece on the board. It's going to depend, because if the NBA goes a particular way and then UFC becomes one of the new, big, shiny deals left on the table, you never know if somebody's going to, kind of grab it as, we've got to get something on our platform that's going to bring in a lot of subscribers or keep a lot of subscribers. We need this. And we've heard reports ESPN wants UFC. They're going to fight tooth and nail to keep UFC. But if I don't know that they have the appetite for 2x. I don't know that anybody has the appetite for 2x. And so with that in mind, I think Netflix is not the company to do it. I do not think they will pay, especially after this deal, they're going to pay another 6 billion over 10 years or whatever it is for just domestic UFC rights. I don't see that. But I do think that when the Peacock deal is up in 2026, right, March 2026, and with UFC, the rights go through 2025. So right now they're in the exclusive negotiation period with ESPN, but then they'll really come up and for open negotiations next year. I do think you get a bundle of what Peacock is offering and the UFC together. I think that makes sense. Um, Eventually, I see you know more of the main brands like Raw or SmackDown getting sold with UFC rights. But right now, I think the library rights, potentially PLE rights, which is like their pay per views, um, being sold together, that would make a lot of sense just in terms of, if you're thinking about from a operations perspective, right? You'd kind of want to have similar people do pay per views for both UFC and WWE because that allows for you to reduce your workforce and just have one, cuts the overhead and just allow one group to control both. So if they're both on the same network, then great, you are able to, streamline that. But it still may not happen because I think one thing the Raw deal reiterates, and the UFC has always been this way, but WWE is still in that suit, is that I think this just reiterates they're going to go for the top dollar deal. I think it will sweeten the pot to have both of those things and get UFC closer to 2x. I still don't think they'll get 2x, but they're going to go for the top dollar deal. I think that's money above everything, right? It's not about strategic partnership. Yes, they've had a great relationship with ESPN. Yes, it's ESPN has built their business, and UFC is a cornerstone of that, and let them have a lot of leeway, as we'll talk about in the next segment, especially recently on certain things. But UFC is going to go after what gives the most money, and TKO is going to support that, especially with Raw not hitting the increase that they wanted, right? They got enough splash with the Netflix name, and stock soared, right? Went up, I think at its peak was like 20%, 15, it went up to 95 from 77. So pretty huge jump. Settled not that high. It settled around 12% ish or 10% ish, but and now is sitting a little bit lower the past day or so. But that being said, right, obviously you have new things come out, and um, it's still a big enough move that Wall Street likes it, because Wall Street, again, always about the future. They are not how are your fundamentals? They don't care about fundamentals. If they cared about fundamentals, then TKO would be so massively undervalued. It's not funny. And that's what a lot of analysts, say, right? Like, speaking of valuing the stock, most analysts have a strong buy on this. They think it's pretty undervalued as an asset. They believe it's going to continue to grow. Price targets ranging from like 115 to 130 in some cases. And so if you're reading those analyst reports and looking at the fundamentals, and you're seeing the price at like 77 or now 87 or 88, wherever it landed, I mean, that's like, whoa, what the heck? Of course I want to buy. But current price always reflects short term and sometimes long term, but most times short term futures. Like, by short term, I mean like 12 months, 24 months. Occasionally long term. In this case, with the Raw deal, I mean longer term, because you have guaranteed revenue coming in, right? Which is, again, another big Ari Emanuel play that we saw Endeavor do with the UFC. Is okay. It might not be able to increase the way we want every couple of years, and we may be leaving some money on the table depending on where the market is, but we also now have 10 years of guaranteed revenue. 5 technically if Netflix backs out and things don't go well at all. But I mean, you now have, okay, this is steady revenue. Really doesn't matter if we're hot and pay-per-view buys are up and ratings are going crazy. They can be terrible, they can be abysmal. It doesn't matter, because we've got at least 5 years. Like, and I'm sure if they cut it early, there's probably some payment that has to be made if Netflix decides to terminate early. But we've got at least 5 years, probably closer to 10 easy, just in terms of with how hot the product is right now, I think even on the WWE side, even if it cooled, I can't imagine it would cool so much that Netflix is like, oh, we're gonna get rid of it here. Um, so providing other things don't get in the way, like allegations and things of that nature, at least 5 years, but probably closer to 10. And that's just guaranteed money. $500 million a year average. That's big. That's huge. $5 billion. That's hard to ignore. And if Netflix loves it and becomes a cornerstone, right? If a bunch of people that do not sign up for Netflix or have not signed up for Netflix, but now this is, here in 2025, subscribers go through the roof, it becomes a cornerstone similar to what happened with ESPN Plus. That's going to be really big too, because that means Netflix will fight to keep it. So it's pretty big there. Circling back to evaluations, another thing I wanted to talk about, right, was uh, we had a couple of investment analysts, Jaguar analysts, I believe, is one, and then TD Cohen, uh, both downgrading from buys to essentially what are holds. So it's not saying like you got to sell this like right away, but um, it's kind of saying like, oh, we don't quite trust this, and we don't think we want to see how things play out. They might easily change their rating based on the Netflix news, right? But when their ratings came out, a huge reason why they rated it as a hold was the antitrust lawsuit for the UFC and media rights too. But the antitrust lawsuit being the biggest risk factor, and then stating, right, that if things go poorly, where they lose the antitrust lawsuit, it could result in them having to pay fighters more and essentially change their business model. Like they won't be able to scoop up all these great fighters and all this stuff. And I believe the price target on TD Cohen was $92 or something. So if they still have the hold right now, you probably should have sold the other day when it spiked, that type of thing. Although again, with that type of news, I'm sure the analysts will at least reevaluate the rating. They may keep it at hold, but they're going to take a look at it again. But that downgrade, right? And you had Wolf Research do similar stuff here. Those downgrades and some of the risks that they're pointing out, right? First of all, if they lose the lawsuit, yes, it's a big hit. It would cause the stock to fall, obviously, and it would cause issues in terms of stock buybacks and dividends, which they call out as risks. And those are valid risks. Those two are valid risks. And shareholders love stock buybacks and dividends because that increases stock buybacks, increases the price of the stock almost every time, pretty much guaranteed to. And dividends, right? If you hold more and more shares, you get paid $3 a share. That gives you just money that you can either reinvest in, TKO stock or in other things. And so you're getting paid to just hold a piece of paper, that imaginary piece of paper at this point. But yeah, so I mean, dividends are nice. A lot of portfolios, as I brought up, I think last week or a month ago, a lot of portfolios of people are, just getting to a certain amount of wealth and buying a bunch of dividend stocks and then using those dividends to kind of live off of or help invest more and build their wealth. So dividends are the safe, like, okay, I like this stock, I like getting paid for it, it's great. That's you know that's not a bad thing. Dividend stocks are pretty good. Growth stocks are one thing, they're more risky. Dividends are the safer option, that are the more blue chip stocks historically that people talk about. So yes, this antitrust lawsuit does affect that ability if they lose, for sure. And of course, it's going to send the stock to fall. However, it's not going to fundamentally change things, as they've stated. You're not going to have the UFC not be able to keep fighters under these long contracts. We've already seen the sunset clause pretty much get negated and go away. And they still hold all the cards here, and there's no injunctive relief on the table. So even if they pay money out the wazoo, it's, can't have John Jones versus Francis Ngannou in PFL in a year. That's not going to happen. Can't have, Conor McGregor just hop ship, or Adesanya. Those aren't things that are possible in this regard. So that's not happening. So that's not really a correct risk. And then doubling fighter pay or paying fighters more, that's also not needed, right? Like maybe to hedge from future lawsuits, they start to up fighter pay and bump them, you know, from, Dana White Contender Series style to like what their actual minimums stated would be, like 12 and 12 or 16 or something. Sure, maybe, but they're not going to double. I believe in both analyses, they both were like, well, fighter pay could essentially double and this could cause a huge issue. Like they're not going to double fighter pay. And if they do bump up fighter pay, they may bump up entering level fighter pay. They're not going to bump up everybody's pay. That's not a thing. They're not going to increase fighter costs by 2x because they had to pay a bunch of money in a lawsuit. That's not going to happen. Sure, they may pay more if they want to really like nip this in the bud and they're okay with it. I'm sure there'd be a risk analysis done right on that of risk benefit analysis, but cost benefit analysis. That's the word I want. But it's not going to be this like, oh, all of a sudden you've got a ton of money lost where they can't buy dividends or can't buy stock buybacks to do dividends. Fighter pay is doubled and fighters can go everywhere. No. And I believe one of the analyses said that could one of the analysis said like, oh, that could cause the stock to drop 55%. That's absurd. That's absurd. A lot of things could cause the stock to drop to 55% if they all happen back to back or if business started to slow. But business is strong, very strong amongst WWE and UFC right now. And yes, they both have pretty wild risks associated with them. With the Vince McMahon lawsuit, which again we'll get into here in a minute, and the antitrust lawsuit against the UFC, but their business models are very much intact, and they're only making more money, right? Even though it's only a 1.2, 1.3 increase in terms of Raw going to Netflix for WWE, that's still a big deal. And UFC, I imagine is going to still get 1.5 to 1.7, even with the market changing as it has, right? Like I can't imagine, even with the market softening, you're going to have them not get over 1.5. There'd have to be some other key to it. So, or the market would really have to downturn, which is possible, right? Media is a little bit rough, lots of layoffs going on. So, you never know. But I think they'll get minimum 1.5. And that's still a huge increase. So they're fine fundamentally. UFC in particular is crazy fine. WWE is also still very, very fine fundamentally. They're still both very profitable. This isn't going to cause a crazy collapse. Investors may overreact, and there may be, a run where everybody's trying to get out of it. Sure, that can happen all the time, but they're too strong fundamentally. I can't see a 55% collapse. I just can't. I can't see it. And now, I mean, do not take my word as financial law. If you're trading any of this stuff off of me, you got issues. This is just informative, but yeah, I can't see it collapsing in that regard. And that's pretty much most of the TKO stock news. One or two other things to add, and we'll talk about the Vince McMahon lawsuit in the next section here. But in terms of Endeavor, Silver Lake did, there are reports now that came out this week that Silver Lake is going to present in the next couple of weeks a minority buyout plan for Endeavor, which is big because, again, they own Endeavor. They're 71%. They control it pretty much. But they are looking to buy it out, and they're probably going to take it private, right? That was the thing that sent the stock shooting up before. It kind of faded a little bit because there were reports like maybe it's not imminent, but now there's a report out then the next couple of weeks, and that's from the Sports Business Journal, so I trust them. Next couple of weeks, they're going to, present a plan for how that would work. So providing that all goes smoothly, I imagine you see Endeavor shoot up and then get removed. But I mean, taking them private makes sense if they're able to pay out, to the minority shareholders what they want to pay out. And, I could easily see that happening. CAA recently did that. One of Ari Emanuel's most hated rivals got a huge sum from it. And obviously Endeavor stock hasn't been, doing as well as they hoped. It's been struggling from the get-go, but lately it's bounced back a bit, and my guess is it will go even higher after this deal is announced. But yeah, Silver Lake is almost certainly taking Endeavor private, and looks like it'll happen pretty soonish. So we'll keep an eye on that and let you know when and if that does happen. Uh, with that in mind, that's pretty much all the TKO stock stuff. Let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know if you think that some of this analysis that I said is unsound, you agree with, right? If you think TKO stock could collapse, lose half of its value, if you think the Raw deal is good, if you think I'm wrong about the UFC media rights, I'd love to hear all of that. But yeah, I mean, at this point, I think there's a lot going on for TKO, and it's going to be a very interesting couple months for this company, without a doubt. All right, next up, we're going to talk about TKO brand image and how it could affect the stock, right? And affect them going forward. Both the UFC and WWE have pretty major, I don't know if you want to call them scandal. One is a scandal on the WWE side. I don't know if you want to call the antitrust lawsuit a scandal, but it's certainly a negative PR item for the UFC. Both happening around the same time, so this is not great for TKO as a whole. But we've particularly seen between the Vince McMahon lawsuit and Sean Strickland's comments at UFC 297 that there's been some backlash to how both UFC and WWE have handled things. This is recording before the Royal Rumble, so I'm sure there will be, if there's a press conference for the Royal Rumble, this is almost certainly going to get asked. We'll see if it is allowed to get asked. They might say, like, we're not answering questions on that. Who knows? But I can't imagine that won't be brought up or talked about a little bit more. And, TKO has given a statement regarding Vince McMahon saying they're handling it internally. They take these accusations serious, all this stuff. With the Sean Strickland comments, you had an interesting response, I would say, from the UFC and President Dana White, where first you had Sean Strickland go after MMA fighting reporter Alexander Kaylee, who essentially, asked Strickland about some of his comments he made about the LGBTQT plus. Sorry if I get that wrong. I really apologize. But that community, right? LGBTQ plus community. And Strickland's response, he laid into him, said some pretty inflammatory things. Came out wearing a shirt that said, women should be making sandwiches, that a gun in your hand type of thing. Like, pretty, misogynistic shirt, and some definitely some statements, bigotry type statements that got some news coverage. The interesting thing I found about this is when John Pollock followed up with Dana White, right? Dana kind of went after him and said, I don't put fighters on a leash, which is just him latching onto a particular wording. Like, Pollock did nothing wrong. He followed up like he should have. And Dana found a word to kind of spin it, which is what he does. It doesn't matter what John had said. I mean, Dana was going to kind of spin it around and be like, this, we never censor fighters, blah, blah, blah. And that kind of got a big roar of approval from a lot of the far right fan base that makes up the UFC's customers, especially their hardcore customers. I think it was the Nelk Boys, right? Put up a YouTube video like Dana destroys woke journalists or some garbage. Lots of stuff in that regard where I was like, oh, like, okay. And they leaned into it, right? And this isn't shocking if you followed the UFC the past 7-8 years, especially with the rise of Trump, who has been a friend of David and White's forever. They've really leaned into their right and far right consumers, because those consumers are willing to spend money on the UFC, and that's a target that they want to hit. Now, a big thing that was brought up in media circles, but also a couple other places, right, is that 10 years ago, for those of you that are newer to the sport, and I remember when this came out, uh, there was a code of conduct introduced, right? You had a whole thing around Matt Mitrione's comments when he was still in the UFC. Uh, right, I think he got fined. You had Nate Diaz being threatened to be fined over using a gay slur. I know there was a huge uproar when Michael Bisping used a slur against Luke Rockhold after his title win, which Michael apologized for, right? And again, that was during that weird time where, if you remember, I mean, The Office is a cult show, right? Cult classic. And you go back and watch Office episodes, and there's a reason they say you couldn't make it today, because you look at some of those jokes, right? Things like, there are certain words being thrown around that were just casually just in the zeitgeist still, and you could just say them all the time, and it was just a normal thing. There was no backlash. There was no like, hey, don't say that. It was just kind of like, oh, well, this is just types of jokes we make. And so it's one of those things where, during that time, though, in the early 2010s, UFC took the complete opposite stance. They were very much a like, hey, we stand for respect here. We stand for all these other things. Um, we have a code of conduct that an athlete must adhere to. And if you don't, you could get fined, you could get fired. It's a whole thing. And that code of conduct technically still exists. I believe fighters still have to sign it and go through it, so that, at any point, the UFC can pull the trigger and say, yeah, we're releasing you due to a code of conduct violation. But they don't have to enforce it. And Dana, of course, being the promoter he is always going to lean into opportunities like Strickland, because it gets more views, it gets more press, right? It gets more people either hating Sean and wanting him to get knocked out, or liking Sean and wanting him to win. It's Colby Covington's whole gimmick, which is a gimmick, right? And part of the reason he pressed that gimmick to a point where people were like, who cares if it's a gimmick? You're a terrible person, etc. The amount of people I saw, say that about Colby Covington is a lot. But I mean, it worked for him. It got him the notoriety and attention that he wanted. It got him title fights. He got to sit on the shelf for 3 years and get a title fight immediately, right? Like, it's not a it's it's clearly worked in some regards. And you've got Trump coming out with, flanked by Kid Rock and Tucker Carlson and things on pay-per-views. Like, I mean, they're clearly leaning into the far right base that makes up a fair amount of their consumers. I'm sure they've done data analysis on this, regardless of Dana White's personal views and all this other stuff. Like, I'm sure they've done analysis on this and said, great, these are target consumers who are spending the most money on our product. Like, we've got to appease them. I'm sure if it went the other way, they would do the exact opposite. In fact, I mean, if you're looking at some of the comments that were made, I forget by which fighter, but one of the fighters at 297 definitely spoke about Israel Palestine stuff, and that was definitely cut from the YouTube upload of the post fight speech. And there's been the whole flag debacle about, like, flags are allowed and then they're not allowed, and now they're allowed. Like, it's all just depends. All just depends on current circumstances. I cannot stress this enough. Dana's job, first and foremost, is promotion. He's going to say things where he contradicts himself quite a bit or changes his mind quite a bit, because that's what he needs to do as a promoter to keep the fan base and the promotion in the best light of their target consumers. So he's going to keep doing that stuff. Beyond moral, yes or no's. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about this from a moral standpoint. I never do. I always look at it from a business only lens as much as I possibly can. And from this particular standpoint, they're leaning into it because they're looking at customer acquisition. Now, in WWE's case, right, completely different scandal with some of these horrific allegations, which, I mean, there's a presumption of innocence in the court of law, but not in the court of public opinion. And if you look at the filing, which I don't recommend if you have a weak stomach for some of the things that are mentioned, I only read through part of it and then I was like, yeah, that's enough. I'm good. um, but I've seen clips and people talking about it. It, I mean, these are horrific and pretty like terrible allegations, and they pretty much implicate, at least in the story that was broken, they pretty much implicate Brock Lesnar because they mention a former UFC champion, which I don't think Kane managed to do this stuff in 2022. And so I'm pretty sure, it was probably Brock who had some of this stuff go on. But I mean, that's a completely different type of PR nightmare that WWE is going to have to navigate. And TKO too, right? Even though it says on TKO's site, like, oh, he hasn't actually been involved, like Vince McMahon is executive chairman of the board with a little asterisk. He hasn't actually been involved in the board since September 2023, which is just weird, right? I think it's like keep his name there, but also like cover yourself in terms of like he's not actually involved. But he's this whole allegation set off the initial investigation, right, into McMahon and WWE, which then they handled internally. They kept, basically NDAs and all this stuff. This was the initial one that happened. Now you've got Ms. Grant fighting the allegations, or I guess not really, not fighting the allegations. Now you have Miss Grant, who is the woman who brought the allegations, and originally it was under an NDA. Now saying the NDA was broken due to stop payments, and now she's basically filing a lawsuit under sex trafficking and abuse rather than like broken NDA. And no matter how this plays out, right? This is a very bad look for WWE, with especially with the way they've handled Vince McMahon, right? Where he left, he then came back, then he left again, all this stuff. And it's gonna be much more of a leaning into probably the left type of audience, right? For these types of allegations. You're not going to have them come out and say like McMahon is a hero and this is BS, blah blah blah. I mean, McMahon's own representatives have just essentially repeated that fact, but you're not going to have, I think, a similar response of the company backing or turning into this as the UFC did with Strickland, which I don't think UFC would do that if similar allegations happened on their side. They might ignore it, but I don't know that they would turn into it, right? But they're going to have to figure out a way to either clean house or spin this PR around quite a bit. They've already basically distanced themselves from McMahon, saying like he doesn't really do anything here. He's not running things. But I can't imagine he's not fired as chair of the board. I can't imagine he's not completely, let go, as well as some of the other executives named in this, because it wasn't just McMahon, it was several other people at WWE. I'm assuming you're going to see an internal investigation with a lot of people being let go. Maybe some more high profile names, depending on who it all affects. But it's a far different issue. Still one of the worst things that could happen, and brand wise, right? And so you've got both of your companies under TKO now dealing with these brand fights, of bigotry on one side, being accused of sexual, terrible, like sexual assault plus more, on just horrific accusations on the other. And this is a company that contracts with Disney for media rights group, right? ESPN is under the Disney umbrella for the UFC, and USA Network and CW, now Netflix, a brand new deal with relationships starting out. If I'm a Netflix exec and I see this is not the thing you want to see after announcing a major 10-year deal with your new partner, right? Like this is the last type of thing you want to see, where it's like, well, that's not great. Now it could be worse. It could be like someone currently still, it could be like a Nick Khan instead of Vince McMahon thing, or somebody that's at TKO and much more involved currently, where it could be a huge problem. But it's still not good. And the perception from the outside is certainly one that's going to raise a lot of scrutiny from the mainstream media and a lot of scrutiny from particular entities, right, that need to protect their own brand, right? Your partnerships are where this really comes into play for TKO, because the last thing you need as you're trying to renegotiate UFC rights, they got the Raw deal done and announced, so that was good on WWE's part, but they still are going to have the Peacock stuff come up, right? The last thing they need is for really bad PR and really bad, stuff turning away potential partners and then using that as part of an excuse to either lowball for rights or to walk away because they just don't want to be involved in it. And we'll see how this all plays out. This is all pretty new on the WWE side. On the UFC side, it's already mostly blown over, which is not surprising, right? This is how it works, especially Strickland losing at 297. I think if Strickland wins, it could snowball into an issue. But now that he's lost, and Dana White's essentially said, "Hey, we're not gonna run it back," even though it was a very, very close match, and he wasn't available for media questions after the fight. I think that was a strategic move by the UFC. They pretty much wrapped up the Strickland issue. Although it's not an isolated incident, so they're going to have to keep an eye on it. But for WWE, this is now a huge thing they've got to deal with. And protecting your brand in that regard is going to be a struggle and could easily affect their partnerships and their rights and the stock, right? Even if it doesn't actually affect that stuff, investors will get spooked and run off. Saw TKO stock when it was announced have a kind of short dip, recover, and then I think end lower. Like that's the type of stuff that can hurt you. Part of their initial drop in stock and TKO stock was from some of the allegations, Vince McMahon selling a bunch and all this other stuff, but then some of the allegations being put out there. This is not going to help things. So TKO needs to turn around their brand image a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing a couple things out here and there that helps polish their brand a bit, as well as kind of nip these two things in the bud real quick. UFC, I think they've done that with Strickland. WWE, they've got to figure this out ASAP. And remember, WWE stuff affects UFC now. That's why we're talking about it. It's not just like, hey, this has now become a wrestling MMA podcast. It's like, no, this is because they are in this together. If WWE, if they sink or the UFC sinks, vice versa, like the other is in trouble with them. That's the important thing to remember in all this. So we'll see what happens there. But they desperately need to start fixing that stuff moving forward because it's gonna hurt them eventually. If this doesn't, something else will. Wouldn't be shocked if this doesn't hurt them either. But yeah, it's two different worlds, one main company. It's hard to juggle two brands like that. WWE, especially being more kid friendly, or was, right, till more recently, and still kind of is. And then UFC being what it is, it's very hard to juggle this, and this negative PR is not good. They've got to do something to turn it around. What that will be, I don't know, but expect something that is good PR for both of them soon. All right, I'm gonna go through these last two things quickly. They were gonna be quick anyway, but we'll speed it up a little bit. Next two things we need to talk about. First is Kayla Harrison getting signed by the UFC. A big shock announcement. Nobody really saw that coming. You had PFL say that Kayla Harrison had one more fight on her deal, and now she is scheduled to fight Holly Holm at UFC 300, which is hypothetically a big fight on paper, right? A lot of MMA media reacted to this pretty positively. A lot of fans were shocked by this, hardcore fans. But here's one thing I just want to get out there and I'm curious about and curious to get your opinion on. While Harrison is certainly been touted as a superstar, right? When we look at the metrics of what Harrison has done, she's moved the needle a little bit on PFL stuff, but not to a level of like, we're talking 300K viewership, or if she's there, and 120 if she's not, right? She's been on PFL fights during the seasons, or in main events where she's bumped the numbers a little bit, but not, still episodes for a particular season have mostly remained in line on average. They haven't been affected by her presence to the point of really noticeable positive influence or negative, right? That could be an option, but she's not a negative draw to them. She's definitely either not really affecting ratings or a slight positive. And all you have to do is just look back through the seasons, right? Like the episodes kind of maintain based on a particular episode, they maintain the same type of average throughout. This past season, when you've had some bigger names from the UFC come over, there you've seen the occasional bump based on like Anthony Pettis headlining, or I think Shane Burgos's headline did pretty solid, but not Harrison specifically. And then when you get to the pay-per-view fights, right, where she headlined, the reports from that are that did abysmal, right? And I don't know the exact numbers, and maybe they did okay, but the reports on that were not one to tout as like a resounding success. And I want to be clear here again, because this gets asked every time. I'm not rooting for PFL to fail. I want PFL to succeed. I'm just talking about a report in terms of Kayla Harrison's buys. In fact, if I quickly look it up, let's see what we got. I looking at this, I mean, there doesn't even show up in terms of like, oh, like X amount of buys if you do a quick search. It's just it is what it is. And PFL's like everybody was happy with pay-per-view debut results, and this is from my buddy Drake Riggs over at MMA Mania. So PFL was happy with it, but and you like you had Racef Hotel MMA Junking. Everybody was happy with it. You got to start somewhere, and yeah, I mean in terms of the starting out, right? Like I mean, it's not hard to be profitable on pay-per-view or at least break even, right? Depends, but it's not that. But I mean, this wasn't some resounding success if she brought in 150K 200 buys, right? Anything of that nature. I believe it was one Wrestling Observer newsletter reported it was like 10,000 buys or something. But it is what it is. And in terms of Bloody Elbow here has pay-per-view stinker, all this other stuff. So it's one of those things where it's hard to be on pay-per-view, right? Bellator, um, Bellator tried this several times, and it's hard to be in the pay-per-view market unless you've got that market dominance, because it's about getting casual viewers. It's about getting a ton of casual viewers, and it's very hard to get that going. So, it's not a knock against PFL in that regard. But tying that back to Harrison, right? It's not that, oh my gosh, Kayla Harrison is on something we have to watch. And a lot of media and people have kind of lifted her up and put her in this position of like, man, she is like the next Cyborg. She's the next Rousey. She gets compared to Rousey all the time. And PFL did an amazing job marketing her that regard. Like you've got to give props to PFL or PFL's PR and marketing team in terms of positioning her as the new Rousey and all that stuff. And then she lost to Larissa Pacheco and all that stuff. But they've still done a great job like maintaining her aura for what it was, especially with the bounce back against Aspen Ladd. And so they've, especially in the hardcore circle and media, MMA media is, touts her as this huge, like, oh, she's going to be a star. But there's been no real movement there that you've seen. Like, there's nothing I can point to that says like, yes, like she's going to be there. What I have seen is since her signing, social media metrics are up for her compared to others, some other fights. I will say that, right? So I think she's got more drawing power and interest than your average off the street or like a really good, prospect, right? We're not, you've got plenty of amazing people coming in who should garner more than they do, but again, don't necessarily until they get on the UFC stage. But do I think Cedric Dubé, who went to PFL recently, who sold out PFL in France in like 20 minutes or whatever? Do I think she's got his star power? No, not even close, in my opinion. And I am curious to see how this turns out, because especially against Holm, right? Who Holmes still has some drawing power and rub from beating Rousey. That's why she's in all of these positions. Everybody's asking why Holly Holm main event. Why? It's because she has a big drawing power in the casual female demographic, which is a market that UFC is trying to go after. So while we're sitting there watching, why are we watching a Holly Holm for the 10th time this year? She's pulling in the right social media numbers and demographic numbers. The UFC is like, yep, put her there, put her there. It's all data driven. I'm telling you this. It's not that just randomly like, oh yeah, give Holly whatever. Data already, in emails that just got released about Holly's contract, talked about like being mad at Holly for certain things. No, they're not. It's not because they love Holly. It's because she's pulling in the right stuff. So I think the thought and hope here is, which makes sense, is you get Holly in against Kayla and you hope that Kayla just destroys Holm and then starts to build on that female demographic and become a new Rousey, right? That's their dream scenario. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's their dream scenario. But depending on how the fight goes, right? And this is Harrison's first fight at 135, and she was fighting at 155 and cut, and fought at 145 once, I think. Like that's a tough ask. And we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But I don't see her as being an immediate I'm on UFC, I'm a superstar type deal, right? I'm on the biggest platform now. I'm going to be a superstar. I don't see that yet. I don't think there's any indication that she'll move a needle for a while. If she beats Holm decisively and then starts to work her way up, maybe. But women's bantamweight is also pretty tough, just in terms of gaining star power because there's not a ton there. There's enough legacy, like Nunes hinted coming out of retirement. That would be a big boost, sure. But this is the type of thing where it's going to take some time to build. She's not this major superstar that you see a lot of MMA media put out there. Like, oh my gosh, it's Kayla Harrison. Like, yeah, maybe in hardcore circles, but she's not drawing outside of that right now. She could, but it's not a wow. Like, we signed someone who's already pulling in stuff. Let me know your thoughts on that. Let me know if you think Kayla is going to help move the needle on this. I mean, UFC 300 is going to be hard to say who moved what where. But let me know if you think she's going to immediately start to get some star rub and go on to do things. But right now, I don't see it. All right. Last but not least, we are talking PFL Bellator updates. They had their Champs versus Champs press conference. Fight going down, card going down, February 24th. It's a very awesome idea, interesting idea. Something Bellator has done a couple times with Ryzen that people have always clamored for. It's pretty great. I think PFL versus Bellator, when they were two separate companies doing this, would have always garnered a fair amount of like interest, especially from hardcore and some non-hardcore fans. Be like, oh, okay, it's not the UFC against another promotion. That obviously is the one where it's like, whoa, this could change everything, and UFC would never go for it. But it's a cool concept. It's going to happen every year, according to Peter Murray, who also stated at the conference that they're going to do 4 main franchises, right? The PFL main tournament, the regional scenes where you're going to have your PFL Europe. They're doing PFL MENA. There's going to be 6 of those regional areas. And then you can kind of, depending on you winning those championships, you can go into the main PFL tournament that we all talk about. It's going to be half Bellator, half PFL fighters, at least to start. We'll see where that all goes. But it's a cool concept, right? Called it the Champions League, but it's basically okay, you win your region, you can get into the main tournament and you can win the whole thing and become a mainstay, and then do champs versus champs. 30 global events. A lot of them seem to be in Europe. They're going to go to Australia. They're going to go a couple other places. I'm assuming they have the World Series of Fighting lawsuit behind them at this point. I haven't heard anything more on that, but I believe it got resolved last I checked, at least, or like settled outside of court. And so going to do that, and they're going to have champs versus champs every year, where current Bellator and current PFL champs go head to head in kind of like a kickoff to the season. It's a very cool concept. I like it. I think it is going to be more digestible to the regular casual sports fan who wants more types of sports and is new to MMA. I think that's a good base entry, right? Instead of marketing to someone who may want to see a particular fighter, you're pitching a model that they can hypothetically get behind, which has been the PFL's whole pitch the whole time, right? That's really what they've been trying to do. But the most interesting part to me is the discussion around the regional scene. I think that's a big deal, especially in the MENA region, in Europe and some other places where Bellator tried to do some of this, right, with their European series. But UFC certainly has a stranglehold on the global market and is still going to be far and away the biggest player in pretty much any of their spaces. But one of their Achilles heels in market share, and I don't know that I would call this Achilles heel because it's not that much of a not much of a problem, but an opening to take away or erode part of the UFC's market share is in regional promotion, right? The UFC, regardless of being this global powerhouse and going, to host events around the world, they generally only do events, you know, uh international events, right? And places they might show up once a year, more likely once every other year in a particular area, right? I think UK has kind of become more of a spot where they're showing up regularly. France had been a spot that they were going to, and I think they will still go to just because of Gone. They don't have Dubai, which is wild. That's a whole nother story because I think that would be a huge push for them and something that they would have gone. PFL will certainly do, is doing PFL Europe, France, and will push that market hard with him. But I mean, you had what, Mbappe show up for one of his fights. I think like that's a real big deal. But it's getting into, and that's actually a great example, right? Getting into these markets where UFC shows up maybe once or once a year, once every other year, and they don't have a clear star to put on it, and then building a star, getting someone like Cedric to be the face of that region, that allows you to get a lot more fan interest in that region into your promotion and start to take some of those casual fans away because they're going to be like, oh, well, Cedric's over here. Like that. I know he's from my country, right? Like it's the same type of thing in wrestling, right? A little bit with New Japan, where you got New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is not really known in the States and not huge amongst, I mean, hardcores, yes, but not amongst the casual fan base. But in Japan, I mean, New Japan Pro Wrestling is pretty massive, right? In terms of a wrestling company. Like it's that's the wrestling company. And so building out these regional tournaments and then going in and taking those pieces of market share, that allows you to take away what was previously just the UFC's because there was no one else there and it was a scarcity issue of, okay, we want MMA, here's a big MMA company that's not regional. Great, we're going to go watch it. That's where I'm going to put my money. Instead, it's like, oh, this is a competitor to the UFC. It's not UFC, but maybe they're not even as big as UFC, but they've got some former UFC guys. They've got a name I recognize and from my country. Like, okay, I'm going to go to here. And that, depending on disposable income and how much of an MMA fan they are, they're going to go to both, right? Or pay for both. But for some of those casual people, that's a way to erode and take some of that share. So I think that's a very smart plan on PFL's part, is these regional tournaments and interests, right? And hosting events there regularly. Like if you do a tournament every year in the region, that's going to start to build your fan base a little bit more compared to UFC coming and leaving every other year, right? Now, this in no way is going to erode it to a point where it will probably hurt the UFC. They may not even see a decrease, right? Because the scarcity of UFC being there and them being the biggest promotion will always bump them up in a certain regard. Maybe it affects some of their ticket sales in some of their gates, but so far it hasn't, right? From PFL Europe and what Bellator is trying to do. And it might be more of a like, okay, the market isn't saturated there, so you can cut out and carve part of this piece before the UFC completely saturates. It might take away future UFC business, but I don't know that it will hurt current UFC business there. So anyone thinking like, oh my gosh, like this could start to erode, like that's not at all what I'm saying. It's going to erode their potential. That's how I should phrase it. It erodes their potential market share rather than their current. I don't think their current is going to slip in any of these regions, but the leftover potential market there, you could have PFL Bellator scoop up, which is big for PFL Bellator because that's how you grow your brand, and that's how you moderately to well succeed against a behemoth like the UFC. That's how you have to do it. So that's the one that interested me. Again, the model itself will be interesting to some sports fans. We'll see how much traction it gets. I know with sports betting, that's another way to get more people involved, and I'm sure this model will lend to that a little bit more with some of the tournament format, but too early to tell there, but important updates nonetheless. Let me know if you like this new update the PFL Bellator has rolled out. I'm a big fan. I think it's good for business on their side. I think it's the right way to move forward. We'll see what it yields, but I think it's probably the best thing they could have done at the time. Have this champ versus champ type of fight every year, and then regionals and the big tourney. Let me know your thoughts on all that, because it's definitely a move, and I think it's the right one. All right, guys, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast, the FBP, as I like to call it. Like, share, subscribe if you haven't done that already. If you're listening on audio, appreciate you guys as always. Sorry if my voice started to go towards the end there. Still not 100% healthy, but was super happy to do 2 podcasts in back-to-back weeks. Hopefully this is a trend we can build on. Let me know if there's any topics you want to cover. Again, antitrust lawsuit's going to be the biggest one, and some of the other things happening with TKO and the UFC. UFC has big events coming up, a couple of different business things I've been hearing about, rumblings. We'll see if those rumors start to kind of emerge. If they do, I'll be on top of them. But love you guys as always. And until next time, get money.